Are you looking for more out of your life? Do you need ideas on how to start new businesses and how to move forward in your own personal life? Well, guess what? You have come to the right radio show. At You Can Overcome Anything podcast show, you will learn and hear from many people from all walks of life who are sharing their challenges, their stories, the habits, and the mind shifts they had to overcome to become who they are today. On top, you will get a chance to connect and see how you can overcome anything by networking and learning about your next move through this radio show. I present to you our great speakers at You Can Overcome Anything podcast show with your host, Cesar Espino. Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of You Can Overcome Anything podcast show. It is your host, Cesar Espino, and you can find me at www.cesarrespino.com. And today I have a special guest. Her name is Dr. Michelle Bengtson. How are you, Michelle?
I'm wonderful.
Great. Awesome. So let me give you a little bit of Michelle's background. So Dr. Michelle is an international speaker and the author of 3 bestselling award-winning books: Hope Prevails, Insight from a Doctor's Personal Journey Through Depression, Hope Prevails Bible Study, and Breaking Anxiety Grip: How to Reclaim the Peace God Promises. She has been a neuropsychologist in private practice for more than 20 years, where she evaluated, diagnosed, and treated children and adults with a variety of medical and mental health disorders. This doctor knows pain and despair firsthand and combines her professional expertise and personal experience with her faith to address her patients' issues, both for those who suffer and the ones who care for them. Using some practical tools, she affirms worth and encourages faith. Dr. Bengtson offers hope and key to unlock joy and relief, even in the middle of the storm. She and her husband of 30 years have 2 young adults, sons, and reside in the Greenville, South Carolina, and she blogs regularly on her own site. Amazing. I love it. Well, so before I dive into that, because I want to know definitely more about that, tell me a little bit about you growing up as a kid.
I grew up in Midwest Michigan in a family with both my parents were there, and I had a younger brother, and we were surrounded by dozens and dozens of cousins. So we got together quite frequently. So family is a real integral part of my life and a real important part, and one that I really want to instill in those that I talk to, as well as my own kids, to realize, I'm always telling my kids that friends will come and go, but your family is there forever. So family is a real high priority for me.
That's awesome. One thing that came to mind is that sometimes when we think of friends or family, right? A lot of times, you might be in a family environment where there might be some toxic family members that maybe are not influencing you in a positive way. How do you deal with something like that? Because I think that when you think about it, definitely I'm with you. Like, I think family is a foundation of a lot of different aspects. And then at the same time, you might have, just like anything else, some bad apples that might be influencing you in a negative way. And that can hold you from really moving forward in your life, right? So how do you deal with that? Because like they said, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family, right? So how do you deal with that?
And I actually had an opportunity to have to deal with that, Cesar. When I was growing up, my mother struggled with depression my entire childhood, except we didn't know that. I didn't have that label. For me, it's just the way she was, right? And, we can develop depression when there's someone who has struggled with it in our family because there's a genetic contributor. But I think the part that we often forget is that when we're raised by someone who struggles with an issue like depression or anxiety, they also model that behavior. So while I was growing up, my mom raised me looking through a depressive lens the entire time. So to your question, you're right. We cannot always choose who we're reared by, who's in our family, but we can choose to look outside of the nuclear family and look to mentors to help give us a balanced perspective. So while my mom struggled with depression, I decided later in my life that it was important for me to get a mentor because I wanted to make sure that it stopped with my generation and that I didn't follow the same suit that my mom did and raise my children looking through that same lens. So I think it's real important that we surround ourselves by those who maybe are a little bit further along on the ladder in life's journey than we are, and those who will speak truth into our life to help balance out some of those negative influences.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I definitely want to come back and touch on that, on the mentors and also the people that you surround with, because I think that's, again, in many different aspects, that can definitely help somebody's journey in many different ways, right? And I know that firsthand too, where before I didn't see that, and now I feel like is one of those critical aspects of our lives, right? To be able to have that. So definitely want to come back to that. Now, as you were growing up, how was it growing up in, elementary, middle school, high school? Any major challenges that you personally had?
Oh boy, many. Yes, many. Just to start off with, when I was 3, I had a life-threatening illness and doctors didn't know what was wrong, but my fever kept soaring. It got up to 107, which is critical. If you don't get that fever down, then you run the risk of death, and if not death, then brain damage. And so my parents tried everything the doctors told them to do: alcohol rubs and ice baths, the whole gamut. And finally, the doctors were so concerned, they said, just give her aspirin, not knowing that I was deathly allergic to aspirin. Well, as a result of that aspirin, first, the doctors warned my parents that I might not make it through the night. But if I did, I would be mentally challenged and physically deformed for the rest of my life. And I do struggle with a physical deformity. My right foot is about half the size of my left foot, and it's deformed. And so growing up, children are cruel.
Yeah.
And they may be speaking the truth, but sometimes the truth is not necessary and it's not kind. And so I got teased a lot growing up. I'm also of short stature, and so that is often looked down upon. But so I dealt with that, and I got to the point where I would rather that people would ask me about it than not ask and just be awkward, because it's just part of who I am. And quite honestly, there was nothing I could do about it. But then the other area that I struggled is when I was 15, my father died of a massive heart attack. And that was very difficult. My mother was from another country. She didn't have an education. And so I took it upon myself to be the provider for our family at a time when it's really crucial for girls to have their father's influence. And I lost my father, and that was real difficult. And then my mother remarried, and I'm grateful for her that she did, because she had support. But then that was real difficult for me as well, because I went from having one father figure for 15 years to having a new father figure with new rules and new expectations. But, when I look back on both of those scenarios, I think in the long run, they made me stronger. Not that I would want to experience them if I had it to do over. But on the other hand, in a way, I'm grateful, because it taught me that I was able to get through really difficult stuff and survive. And that has boded well for me for my adult years.
Yeah, definitely. I want to take it back a little bit on, growing up, again, at the age of 3, when you have that life-threatening experience, there might be possibly parents that are listening to the show right now. And again, maybe their kids are going through something like that. You firsthand seen that from a kid's perspective. Like, you're right. There's so much cruelty, and there's so much bullying. There's so much, so much stuff going on in our schools, right? And so I guess from your perspective, like, how do you deal with that? Because that can get you into a very depressed, situation. It can also get you to, like, well, I'm different, I don't fit in, and then you kind of are on your own, and that leads to many different things from that perspective. So for you, definitely that was not an easy thing. So how do you deal with that? And maybe from a parent's perspective, like, how can you speak to your kids or and advise them of what they can do too, right?
I'm really grateful, because my mother was real strong. And when the doctors told her that I would never walk again, her attitude, I don't know if she ever said this, I don't remember, but her attitude was, not my daughter.
Mm.
And so she really taught me to push through challenges and to look at them as an opportunity to overcome instead of looking at them as a limitation. And that has served me well my entire life. But despite her attitude and really pushing me so that I was able to walk again, I did have to deal with the bullying and the teasing from children. But I think what is so important is that as a culture, we tend to focus on how people look instead of focusing on the attributes that they have that are their strength in character. Looks will come and go.
Mm.
You're going to gain weight. You're going to lose weight. Beauty is finite. But I think it helped that I then devoted my efforts into becoming a good student. And so that's an area where I excelled. I was never going to excel at sports because of my physical limitations, but I put my efforts into excelling as a student, learning how to be a good friend, having compassion for others because I had gone through some difficulty. And I think as a result, if as parents, we will not cater to our children's limitations, but teach them how to push past them and to focus on their areas of strength, because we all have weaknesses. Some are more visible than others, but we all have weaknesses, but we also all have areas of strength. Now, I'm not saying that as a parent, we should tell our children that, they should go on American Idol because they've got a great voice when they really can't carry a tune. I'm not talking about false platitudes. But we all have areas where we are gifted in our own way, where we're talented. Some might be artists, some might be musicians, some might just be because they're empathic and compassionate. So as parents, if we can focus on those qualities instead of the traits that are going to come and go across our lifetime, that sets our children up for success in the areas where they're already ready to flourish.
Yeah, I love that. And it reminds me of there I think there's a chapter, a couple of paragraphs in the book Think and Grow Rich, where Napoleon talks about his son who was deaf, and they didn't accept that for him. They're like, we're not going to accept this. And so I guess the message here is that just because you're getting and I'm not saying don't do this, I'm just saying just because you're getting a professional experience from a doctor, don't accept that to be your truth, right? I mean, because you can definitely create something, and don't limit your kids or anybody or yourself for that matter in believing that that's your new truth, that's your new reality. You can definitely change that. And that's kind of what, your mom and yourself did here. Just like I've seen it in multiple aspects, and same thing with Napoleon Hill and his son, that became like, no, you're going to be a regular kid. I don't care if you cannot hear. You're going to be a regular kid just like anybody else, and just keep going through that fight. It's not an easy fight. You got to be able to push that. The second thing I like that you mentioned is that looks come and go. And that's very true, because a lot of people, we focus so much on the outside that we forget about the inside. And sometimes even people that might be looking like really muscles, beautiful females, men, whatever, and they look good on the outside, deep down, they might be going through a depression. They might be going through something that, that is not visible to the eye, right? And so a lot of that, I love that, compassion, growth, just working on that. And I always say work on the inner self, because then the outer self will show, right? And so I really love that. And hopefully our listeners did get a chance to catch on to those two critical points that you mentioned. So awesome. And then going into that, like, I guess into your early years after high school, right? Did you ever had an idea of what you wanted to become or what you wanted to do? I know a lot of times people, they talked about, well, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be whatever the case may be. Did you had an idea of what kind of field or trade you wanted to practice?
I did. I was one that friends always came to share their problems with. And when I was in middle school, I was part of the peer counseling program, where other students would come in and talk with students and get some outside perspective and have a safe place to share the hurts and the heartaches. And when I did that, that really planted a seed. I knew I wanted to go into some kind of helping profession, and psychology seemed a normal fit. And it was only after I started my graduate school work to go into psychology that I realized that there was this specialty called neuropsychology, which is really about the relationship between the brain and our behavior. And that fits well with my analytical personality, working with patients who have had strokes or head injuries, or there's a question of dementia. It's always like putting a puzzle together to figure out what part of the brain is really working well and what areas are weak, and what can we do to help people get to their best full functioning. So for me, that was an easy fit. But at the same time, as a youngster in junior high and high school, I loved to write. And I just knew in my heart that I was destined to be a writer. But real interesting was that when I went to graduate school, I had professors tell me, you'll never write, you'll never be a speaker, you're no good at this. And I believed them. Even though I'd had people earlier in my life say, this is really good, you should consider being a writer. There was something about the way they said it. I assumed they were the authority. And I believed in it. And so I gave up the dream of writing and speaking until about 10, 15 years later. And I went to a writer's conference and something just clicked. And I thought, I think you've been believing a lie. And it's interesting because our whole conversation today, Cesar, is about what thoughts do we believe in our head. And I think a lot of times we believe lies, but we don't realize they're lies and we accept them as truth. So if I had believed that I was handicapped, which is what the term doctors gave me, that would have limited me. But since my mother wouldn't accept that, I never believed that label for myself. But I did believe that I would never write, I would never speak. And now I find myself writing and speaking almost full time. So it's interesting what beliefs we have that then form the basis for our attitudes and our behaviors after that.
Yeah, and that's another one that I think it's so critical, right? And when we think about it, sometimes the biggest enemy we have are the voices inside of us too. And it normally comes from maybe somebody telling you just a simple comment. Maybe unconsciously they were not trying to put any negative programs into your brain or anything to that matter, yet they might have mentioned something that resonated with you, and then now your unconscious mind or your conscious mind is talking. The logical side of it is talking and say, hey, you are not a writer. Who's going to read your books or whatever the case may be, and you talk yourself out of it. You pretty much talk yourself out of doing that, and that's kind of what happened with you. I love a quote that Les Brown talks about, and he says, somebody's opinion about you should not become your reality, right? Okay. And so when you think about that, it's critical. Like again, an opinion should be an opinion, and whatever you can use, go ahead and use it. Whatever you cannot use, do not use it. Except don't allow that opinion become your truth or your reality, because as you mentioned, that can handicap you in many different aspects, right? And I have a very similar story where when I wrote my first book, I was telling myself that, one, I'm not a writer. I don't like to read. No one's going to read my book. Who's going to purchase my book? And I also talked myself out of doing that until I realized that, what if I change the frame and I start looking at it from a different lens and say, well, if nobody reads my book, that's fine. If nobody buys my book, that's fine. At the end of the day, I want to do this for myself. I want to do this as a self-accomplishment, and that I can leave something behind for my future generation. Whatever happens from that point on, it doesn't matter. I'm going to write this book. When you change that frame, which again comes back to the mind, and you start thinking about it from a different perspective on anything you do, then you can definitely accomplish a lot more, right? And so that's one thing that I did, at least in my case, right, to be able to write the book. So I see from that perspective. So I want to go back, because I think it's all kind of bundled together. So I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier in terms of mentors and surrounding yourself with a different kind of group of people, right? I think that's another a huge foundation of success, right? A lot of people say, well, I don't need to pay somebody to tell me how to jump or whatever, right? Except my question to that is, or my comment to that is, well, have you gone to school. If you go to school, traditional school, and I'm not bad, by no means am I saying it's bad. I'm just saying, as an analogy, you go to school, you pay the school so they can teach you. Well, it's kind of like the same thing when you're paying somebody to be that mentor, right? To teach you that. And I'm a firm believer of mentors. I'm also a firm believer of surrounding yourself with the average 5. So I want to get your input on that, and more so on that comment thing of the average 5, that you surround yourself, then you become.
I think there's so much truth to that, in that we become like the 5 people that we spend the most time with. And they may not excel in anything in particular, or they may each have a different area of strength. But those that we spend the most time with are those who we're going to tend to listen to their opinion over and above other people. And we're going to tend to listen to their input about us, but we also tend to strive to be like them. So I think it's important that we're intentional in choosing who we spend time with, but that we're also intentional in seeking out those who have more experience, more wisdom in those areas that we want to grow in. And that can change over time. I've had a series of mentors. I had mentors in neuropsychology, and I had mentors in public speaking, and mentors in my faith. I've been blessed to have a series of different mentors, but they all served a different purpose. And for the most part, they were all fairly time limited, although I'm sure I could go back to any of them at any time and say, I've noticed that I've kind of hit a plateau and I don't know what to do. Because they're a little bit higher up on the ladder than I am. The way I look at it is that mentors can help shorten the gap for us. And if we're open to their input, we may not have to go through some of the mistakes that they've gone through. But then I also look at it in terms of a reciprocal type scenario, that once we've been mentored, we owe it to those who are a few steps lower on the rung to turn around and mentor others. We've received, now we turn around and we give. And that's a way of passing down to other generations the knowledge and wisdom that we've had to learn through our own hard knocks.
Yeah, I love that. Not only receive, you have to give, right? And a lot of times, sometimes we forget about the second part of giving. And so, I think that's so critical to that. Now, you mentioned you have multiple mentors. How do you go about choosing a mentor? Like, what are your criteria, or how do you classify or say, this is the person that I want to work with? Because again, if there's people that might be looking to maybe get into a mentor, like, what are some of the things that you would consider to be important when finding a mentor?
I think one of the most important factors is that a mentor needs to be someone that you look up to. And you could look up to them for a variety of different reasons. It could be because they've accomplished something you would like to accomplish. It could be because their outlook on life is one that resonates with you. It could be something as simple as, that person just always seems joyful and I would like to be more like them. So that's one of the first things, is you don't want a mentor that you're not going to click with their beliefs or how they live their life. It's someone, if you want to be mentored by them, you want to become more like them. And the second thing is that it's got to be somebody who is willing to give of their time, because mentoring takes time. It took them years to get where they are. And so it's going to take some time for them to figure out where you are and help you see what steps you can take to become more like them. Some are not willing to give of their time or of their knowledge and their wisdom. They're not going to be a good mentor. You want somebody who's willing to impart their information, whether it's a paid mentor or not paid. Either way, it's going to take an investment of their time and your time. But to that point, I would recommend that you never seek out a mentor if you're not willing to put in the time. If you're going to come to the meetings and you're not going to be prepared and you're not going to listen to their input and you're not going to do the homework, so to speak, of what they suggest, don't waste their time, because there are other people who are willing to put in the time. And that's the ultimate insult, is to ask someone to share of themselves and then you don't do what takes on your part.
Right. And I think that's also the foundation on many aspects, right? When, you got to be willing and prepared to make a change in your life. In this case, you got to be willing and prepared to accept any kind of, I call it constructive criticism, whatever that might be, right? It's positive, constructive criticism. You got to be able to take that and be willing to walk and run with that. Same thing like, when we're talking about your practice of neuropsychologist, right? The person has to be willing to accept the changes that are going on, right? Like the unconscious mind and how that might work is that if you're not willing to surrender to that process or be willing to learn or make that change, it may, you're pretty much fighting it, right? You're putting up this wall where nothing's going to penetrate through that wall to get to the unconscious mind, right?
And I've had a long career, and when I look back over it, there are many patients who were willing to do the work. I could tell them, here's where the areas of weaknesses are, here's what you need to do to get us where you want to go. And those who would do the work would see improvement. But then I also had many patients who would come back a year, 2, 5 years later, and they would be worse off. And I'd sit down with them and say, I'm looking back on my notes and I recommended A, B, C, and D. Did you do those? And many would have excuses for why they didn't do them. Well, it's no wonder that they came back in a worse shape because they didn't listen to the advice that they paid me to give, and I knew it would help. It's the same way in a mentor relationship. Yeah. So if you're not willing to listen to another person's perspective and accept it as possible truth, then don't waste the time getting into a mentor relationship, because that's what it's for. It's so that we can take the blinders off and see what's holding us back so that we can overcome those areas of weakness.
Yeah, love that. Can you tell me a little bit about your books?
Absolutely. The first book, Hope Prevails, Insights from a Doctor's Personal Journey Through Depression, it started off, Cesar, as a book that I planned on being a resource for those who couldn't come into my office. And the reason was because I got emails, text messages, social media messages all the time from people who it would not be feasible for them to come into my office for help. People from other countries, from other states, but yet they could tell that I was doing the work that they needed. And so I anticipated writing a book that could be a resource that would give them the same information that I would give if they were in my office. But at the very beginning of writing that book, I came down with a life-threatening illness, and I went on bed rest, medically induced bed rest for 5 months. I went from 113 pounds to a skeletal 74 pounds, which is 30 pounds lighter than I am today. And I was kept alive on IV hydration and nutrition. All that to say, during that illness, I wasn't able to be the doctor. I couldn't go see patients. I was in bed every day, and I became terribly depressed. But having gone through that, and then trying the things that I'd always told my patients to do, they helped. But I realized that there was more to overcoming depression than what I had realized as a doctor. And so the book that I ended up writing really chronicled my journey for how did I get out of that depression, and what did I then realize needed to change for myself as well as for my patients. And it changed everything. And now when people write to me or when they leave reviews on Amazon, they usually talk about one thing first, and that is that the book is really written from a dual perspective. That first of being a doctor with all the alphabet soup after my name. But the second part is having gone through it myself. As they read the book, they know I understand. And people don't care about what you know until they know that you understand and you care about them. So that's what most people will say about that book is they're willing to take the advice that I give in it because I'm not just speaking as a doctor, which that book would have been had I not gone through that depression myself. And then readers asked me to write a Bible study, and I did. And then readers came back and they asked me to write a book on anxiety. And I'll be honest, I didn't want to do it. And the reason I didn't want to do it is because I had just gotten through 2 heavy-hitting books on depression. I wanted to write about chocolate or iced tea or beaches or something lighthearted, right? But I had so many readers write to me and say, please write a book on anxiety. And it made perfect sense because so many people who struggle with anxiety also struggle with depression and vice versa. So breaking anxiety's grip is really helping people to understand, where does that anxiety come from? But more importantly, how do we break the grip that it has on our life? And again, it's written from a dual perspective because my family has a long line of those who struggle with anxiety. When we go to a family reunion, it's like walking into a walking anxiety disorder. So I've been there. But I'm happy to say I'm on the other side. And so my hope for these books is that in a way they mentor the reader to say, I understand where you are and I understand how hopeless it feels, but let me stretch out my hand to you and say, come with me because I'm on the other side. And I can tell you from personal experience, you don't have to stay there.
Wow, I love that. I want to go back to the first book. I'm curious to know maybe just one of the things that you did, because if you were in bed rest for that long and being able to come out of that, like what is one thing that you did to help you with that? Because that definitely was not an easy an easy thing for you, right? So how do you deal with that, or how do you deal with that? And what was one thing that you might have done to help you through that journey?
If I'm perfectly honest, I will tell you that that was such a devastating time in my life. I was so physically ill. And when the depression set in, I remember crying out to God and basically saying, if this is going to be my life, I'm not sure I want to keep living. And I certainly cannot go back to my private practice and be that doctor who tells people how to get well because I'm not well. Yeah. And I've tried all the things that I would normally suggest to my patients. And while they helped some, they were not enough. I'm a Christian and I believe in Jesus Christ. And so this may not resonate with all of your listeners, but I can tell you what I realized through that journey is that I had been listening to a lot of lies in my head, such as I remember when I was so depressed, I believed the lie that I must just be joy immune because I would look at all these other people from my sickbed and they seemed so joyful. And here I was trying everything I knew to try and it wasn't helping. And so I just started to believe the lie that I must just be one of those people who's not capable of experiencing joy. But I happen to believe in the Bible, and that has been my foundation since I was a child. And one day when I had that thought, I must just be joy immune, I remembered a Bible verse that said, although weeping may last for the night, my joy comes in the morning. And I can't really tell you even what it was about that, except that remembering that verse that I remembered from a child, I realized if God says that his joy comes in the morning, and his Bible is for everybody, then it has to apply to me. So I must not really be joy immune. And that switched a switch for me. And everything started to change after that, after I started writing down scripture verses and reciting them and really applying them to my life. That changed everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. I got out of the depression. I became physically healthier again. I started treating my patients differently. I started parenting differently. And I started realizing how much influence our mind does have over us and how it is so important that we feed our mind truth. And so things have never been the same since then, to the point that I remember one time, just a couple of years ago, well after that experience, I was working on a speaking engagement and a friend was helping me with the slides. And I remember saying, oh, I can't figure this out. I'm just so stupid. Well, because I had started parenting my children differently about the truth and the lies that we believe, my son, who was 10 years old at the time, turned to me and said, only if you believe that, Mom. So I realized he was not only watching me, but he was listening. And I was not stupid. I'm a doctor. I'm not stupid. What I needed to do was slow down and think about what it was I wanted the slides to convey and share that with my friend who was helping me with the slides. But had he not stopped me in the moment, I just spoke that over myself that I'm stupid.
Yeah.
And we often let thoughts like that go unattended, and we don't contest them. We don't stop in the moment and think, is that a lie or is that the truth?
Yeah.
And that's so critical because, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes other people speak those things over us and they might not even realize what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
A coach, a teacher, a pastor, even a mentor, our parents will speak things sometimes out of frustration or just out of ignorance and not realize that it plants a seed that can have a long-term effect in our lives. So it's so important that we take the time to really dissect what are we thinking and to really sit with it and decide, is that truth or is that
Yeah.
a lie that I've been believing?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I actually just did a video a couple of days back or something, maybe a week ago, and I was talking about words do matter. The words that we speak do matter. And again, in this case, a lot of times we are so easy to judge ourselves, so easy to say, I am dumb, I am stupid, I am this, I don't know better, whatever the case may be, without realizing that we're programming ourselves with those words, right? And then you have the projected words where you might be projecting something to somebody else. And just because you're saying that to somebody else, you're also telling that to yourself because it's coming out of you, or somebody's projecting that over to you. So I was talking about why words do matter. And we have to be very careful on the words that we use and how we choose them. And if you find yourself, like in this case, you find yourself like, I'm stupid, you got to fix that immediately. I'm like, no, wait a minute, I'm not stupid. I have the resources. Maybe I may not know all the answers, but I have somebody that can help me. I have the resources. I can reach out to people. That changing that. And so it's definitely not an easy thing to do. Yet it takes practice, but you have to be conscious of that, and you have to be more careful on what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes the words that we speak over ourselves are the harshest.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're right. It is not easy. When I was in that pit of depression and in that sick bed, it was a lot of work. The Bible happens to say, take captive every thought.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as a neuropsychologist, I can tell you we have between 50 and 70,000 thoughts a day. So that's a lot of thoughts that we need to pay attention to rather than just allow them to flow through our brain and we become more apt to believe them. We need to extend as much grace and forgiveness to ourselves as we're willing to extend to other people.
Yeah, I love that. And I love what you mentioned here. God never wastes our pain. The pain we experience will be used for good some way at some time in our future. And I love that because, again, sometimes we see, you're like in this drama cycle. You're playing the victim in the drama cycle. And you're like, why me? What did I do? Why am I sick? Why am I in this, whatever? Why am I going through this, right? And I love this line here because, again, it talks about, from that pain, God has a different plan for you. There's something that you're not seeing, and that pain, at some point in your life, in your journey, is going to turn around and be something bigger and greater. And you are a true, testament of that, of what you've gone through. Right? You were in very painful times in your life, in your journey, and that led to something bigger and better for you in helping your own family, helping clients, spreading the word of the things you've gone through. So maybe give me a little bit more of that because you're a living, testament to this.
You mentioned self-pity, and I was the queen of self-pity when I was so sick and on that sick bed and depressed. When we get depressed, we're really apt to engage in self-pity, and then nobody wants to be around us when we're like that. But I did that. Just being honest, I remember thinking, why is everybody else so joyful? And how come this had to happen to me? And I can't tell you that I would want to go through either of those scenarios ever again. They were incredibly painful, long and painful. And I remember reading the scripture that says God works all things together for our good. And I remember thinking, how in the world is that going to be? What good is this depression going to do? But now, many, many, many years later, I can look back and be thankful that I went through that episode of depression, because now the book that I wrote, all 3 of them actually, have gone on to help other people. But if you had told me all those years ago that something good would come out of this depression, I'm not sure I would have believed you. For one thing, because I had a real negative mindset back then. But now when I look back and I see that good has come from it, I'm actually grateful that I went through it. Now, I don't ever want to go through it again, but what it has taught me is that when we go through the difficult, painful experiences in life, something good will come out of it. It doesn't always look like we think it's going to look. Since that time, my husband has had cancer. I have had cancer. But even when those happened, I've been able to say, well, I can't wait to see what good comes out of it, because I have a history of knowing God doesn't waste our pain. It will often help someone else, and we will change in the process if we're open to it. And I'm grateful for the growth I've had because of the painful circumstances.
Yeah, I love that. So, Michelle, before I let you go, I have a couple more questions. I'm really enjoying this conversation, by the way. I love every single aspect of this, but I do respect your time. So a couple of questions. If people wanted to connect with you, where can they find you?
They can find me on my website at drmichelleb.com, or I've got a podcast, Your Hope-Filled Perspective, and I'm on all social media as Dr. Michelle Bengtson.
Okay, awesome. In terms of, you were talking about, you were negative in the past, or you had a negative mind, and obviously that's not the case now. What are some things you've done to help you with that, to help you really work on that muscle, the brain, and get you in that positive mindset?
Well, one of the things, and we've touched on it, is I have been in the Word of God. Mm-hmm. As a believer, that's my foundation, and I know for me that is truth. But going beyond that, and going back to our earlier conversation about those 5 that we surround ourselves with, I have been very intentional in those that I allow to speak into my life. And there have been some where I have specifically given them permission that when you see me going down that self-pity route, or when you see me becoming negative, or when you hear me speaking things that you know are not truth, I want you to call it out in me. And that can be painful sometimes. I have a friend who will do that. And I'm going to be honest, when she tells me, I usually go, I don't want to hear it right now. But I know she's speaking truth, and she's speaking out of love, so I can eventually receive it. Right. I've been very intentional. And then there are others that I have been very intentional about distancing myself from, because they tend to engage in self-pity, and they take on the victim role, and they're very negative. And I know for myself, I can't afford to go down that negative rabbit trail, because the deeper you get down there, the longer it is to get out of there. So I'm also very intentional about who I do not spend a lot of time with, and who I won't receive their comments as truth for me.
Yeah, I love that. And in terms of, again, you're a true testimony of overcoming different obstacles, overcoming so much stuff. And I know we touched on that, in terms of how you maintain yourself positive, and even seeing the good of something that might be pain, right? And we touched on that. I just want to know if there's any other habits or any other things that you do to help you with that, because again, going through an illness that nearly kills you, going through cancer, going through all these different things is not an easy thing to overcome. And so obviously we touched about your faith. Is there anything else that helps you with that to overcome those things?
Yeah, one of the most important things for me is to forgive quickly and permanently. Because when I harbor resentment or bitterness or unforgiveness towards someone who has hurt me, it never hurts them. but it always hurts me because it keeps me grounded in the negative. And I can get pretty snarky, pretty resentful. And so what I have learned personally for myself is that the quicker I can forgive somebody when they've hurt me or done harm to me, the better off my mental health is. And then another thing that I've learned for myself is that we can only pour out to others what we have filled ourselves up with. So if I'm not making sure that I'm getting enough rest, if I'm not eating well to feed my brain, if I'm not getting enough physical exercise, and if I'm not filling myself up with those things that are encouraging and positive, then I'm going to pour out of my own well whatever's in my heart. And so if it's negative or if it's depleted, when I'm giving to other people, it's not going to help them. So it's real important to me that I maintain appropriate self-care, which is not selfish. It's important so that just like when you fly on an airplane, one of the first things they tell you is in the event of an emergency, put your own oxygen mask on first, then turn to help other people. So getting enough sleep, adequate nutrition, rest, those are all important for putting my own oxygen mask on. So then I'm responding from a more even keel level place when I am in a situation where others need help, or when they do something that's offensive and hurtful to me. If I start off at a better place, then I can respond more appropriately.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of the people that work with you, you want to talk a little bit about your practices or the things that you work with your clients?
I help people primarily now with things like overcoming depression, anxiety, worry, fear, guilt, and helping people understand who they really are. Just like in my own experience where when I was 3 and that changed kind of the course of my life and I started believing some of those lies, my goal now is to help people understand just how wonderful and amazing they are and to get rid of those areas where they're real quick to throw a stone at their areas of weakness. We all have weaknesses and we can all improve upon those, but we all have areas of real strength, and it's so important that they're able to identify those as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the last thing I have for you, if anyone that's listening to us right now or watching us, they might be going through a challenging time, what would be one advice, regardless of what that challenge might be, what would be one advice that you can give them among all of the things you've already given us to overcome that challenge?
Probably the very first thing that I would say is reach out to someone else. So you're not going through this alone. Mm-hmm. And if you know someone who's been through a similar challenge, reach out to them. Because just like I wrote that book, because I've gone through the depression, in the very beginning of that book, I wrote a letter to my depressed self from where I am now looking back, so that whoever's reading that realizes I understand it. Basically, I'm reaching out my hand to say, let me hold your hand and we'll get through this together. So if one of your listeners is going through a difficult time, first of all, know you're not alone. We all go through those times, but sometimes we don't realize others have struggled because now we're seeing them on the other side of it. And a lot of times we wear a mask because we're afraid to tell people that we're struggling, but reach out to someone so you are not going through it alone.
I love that. Awesome. Well, Michelle, thank you so much. If there's anything else you have that you want to tell our listeners before I let you go.
I think if I was going to say anything, it would be summed up in 2 words, and that is that hope prevails.
I love that. And that's definitely a good way to end this. So, Dr. Michelle, once again, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate all of the input and the ideas, and for you sharing your story with our listeners.
It's been my honor. Thank you, Cesar.
Definitely. And for the rest of you guys, please make sure that you check us out in your favorite podcast platform. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share. And please comment to this post here, this video, this recording. And I will see you guys at the next episode of You Can Overcome Anything podcast show. Have a good day. Bye.
Hi, I'm Cesar Espino, real estate investor, business coach, and consultant, and author of the book, You Can Overcome Anything Even When the World Says No. My number is 424-501-6046. In my book, I talk about making the necessary changes to shift your mind for prosperity and certainty. Pick up your copy at Amazon. I also love helping families with their real estate and can purchase your house fast and all cash. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. My number is 424-501-6046.
Thank you for having me today. I am so glad you tuned in to this podcast. You can find me at Spreaker.com, where you can like and subscribe. And to learn more about myself and my services, you can find me at www.cesarrespino.com, or you can also find me at Facebook under Cesar R. Espino. Once again, thanks for joining me. I am looking forward to having you at the next episode, and know that you truly can overcome anything.